Congressional Democrats now are largely falling in line behind Biden, despite reported panic behind the scenes. According to the New York Times, top Democrats have settled on a strategy that some concede could be dangerous: do nothing, at least for now. The Times notes the consensus among many Democrats is that Biden himself is the problem, and their unwillingness to say so is reminiscent of the way congressional Republicans behaved during the Trump administration, when they would criticize and mock him privately, but profess total fealty in public. Longtime party loyalists say they've been reduced to hoping for another major public misstep by President Biden to either persuade reticent members of Congress to speak out or to convince the president he should leave the race on his own. Democratic senators met yesterday for their first caucus luncheon since returning to the Hill, where they discussed the viability of the president's campaign. Speaking to reporters after that meeting, Democrats remained tight-lipped about what was said inside the room and by whom.
Well, the concerns are whether or not that was a one-off situation, or there is more to the issue.
How confident are you that President Biden will be the Democratic nominee in November?
I am confident at this point, but I will tell you it remains to be seen in the way he campaigns and the effectiveness of campaigning, whether he continues to be the flag bearer for our cause.
Senator, do you still support President Biden?
Yes, I think it's really important that we focus on the fact that President Biden has been a really excellent president. He had a bad debate. Former President Trump had a horrific presidency.
You don't have any concerns about his ability to serve 4 more years?
No.
Do you want him to be the Democratic nominee?
I think if President Biden feels, and he's in the best position to know, that he can take on and beat Donald Trump, then yes, I certainly do, and that's what the president has indicated.
You had a great caucus conversation. It was constructive.
Is the conversation over?
Standing behind the president, but not with exactly ringing endorsements. Meanwhile, one Democratic senator did step out publicly to talk about his doubts about President Biden's chances to beat Donald Trump in November. A source familiar with yesterday's closed-door meeting told NBC News Senators Michael Bennet, Jon Tester, and Sherrod Brown all voiced concerns about the president winning the election. Senator Tester later did not deny the report, but referred NBC News to a statement in which he says the president's debate performance raises serious questions. The spokesperson for Senator Brown declined to comment, but it was Senator Bennet who confirmed his remarks, going on TV last night on CNN, but stopping short of saying the president should drop out of the race.
Well, it's true that I said that, and I did say that behind closed doors, and you guys and others asked whether I had said it, and that is what I said. So I figured I should come here and say it publicly.
Why do you think he can't win in November?
I just think this race is on a trajectory that is very worrisome if you care about the future of this country. Joe Biden was 9 points up at this time. The last time he was running, Hillary Clinton was 5 points up. This is the first time in more than 20 years that a Republican president has been up in this part of the campaign. Donald Trump is on track, I think, to win this election and maybe win it by a landslide and take with him the Senate and the House. And so for me, this isn't a question about polling. It's not a question about politics. It's a moral question about the future of our country. And I think it's critically important for us to come to grips with what we face if together we put this country on the path of electing Donald Trump again.
Joining us now, NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitale. Ali, good morning. It's good to see you. Senator Bennet wanted to say he believes Joe Biden is one of the best presidents in modern American history. He lavished him with praise, but said this moment is too important. His personal belief, again, that's his own personal belief, is that Joe Biden can't win the election. Is that reflective of what you're hearing privately when you talk to Democratic members up on the Hill?
Good morning, my friend. I mean, kind of. I think what Senator Bennet is doing that so many others are not is coming out and putting his name publicly on the things that he is saying privately, both to his colleagues, to his friends, and potentially to reporters. I think that's also why this story has such a dissonance between the public and the private. I know that there are some, and I've heard these complaints, that the media, that reporters are making too much of this. And it's largely because there is still a large number of Democrats behind the scenes who are griping, who are panicked, who are saying it to their colleagues, and who are actively weighing whether or not now is the time to come forward and say publicly either that they have concerns, as Senator Bennett was saying, or that they want Joe Biden to step down. Right now, the public numbers on that are only at 9 on the House side. There are no Senate Democrats who are saying Joe Biden can no longer be the nominee and he needs to step down. Bennett and Senator Patty Murray are some of the only ones who have gone so far as to say that they have questions, in Bennett's case, to outright question the electability of the president. But that's what the rest of this week, I think, is going to be shaped by, is whether or not the people who have private concerns are willing at this point to make them public. I mean, you bring up the other 2 senators who are in that room yesterday saying that they have concerns about Biden's ability to win. Both of those same senators are in key Senate seats that are needed. They are essential for Democrats to have any shot of maintaining what they have in the Senate, let alone even think about growing it. If those 2 people start stepping forward, then I think you have a really different dynamic here. But the Senate is also a different beast than the House. I think on the Senate side, many of us are looking to the ways that senators will handle this moment, in large part because Joe Biden was a member of their ranks for so many years as a senator. It's a body that he pays close attention to. It's a body that he respects. And those are the colleagues, I think, in my conversations who could have more of an impact on the president if they were to try to make a final push to try to get him to renounce himself as the standard bearer of this party. But I think by and large yesterday, what could have been an inflection point sort of just ended with a collective sigh and this sense of resignation that it's sort of getting close to the time to turn the page on this. And you've got to come together, unite, and support the nominee.
Yeah, Jonathan Lemire, the front page above the fold, the New York Times, that piece we just referred to, top Democrats swallow fears and back Biden. So for the most part, the Biden campaign in the White House has done its job of keeping Democrats on board over the last almost 2 weeks now since the debate. Some vigorous support, some less vigorous from Democrats. You had Chuck Schumer on the Hill yesterday answering every question about this with "I'm with Joe, I'm with Joe." They are publicly standing by Joe Biden, but it does feel tenuous. They're hoping that there is not another moment in public from President Biden that may change the way they have to deal with this.
Yeah, there's no question the dynamic here in Washington, as Ali just mentioned, is very different what we're hearing in public versus private. There's a lot of private anxiety about President Biden. And there was a real sense that the White House and the reelection campaign last week wasn't doing nearly enough to try to tamp that down. And even finally, when he sat down for that interview with George Stephanopoulos on Friday, that didn't ease too many nerves. This week, though, has been different. The president and his team have been far more aggressive. He has repeatedly, he's had public appearance after public appearance. He's had a lot of private calls, including the Democratic mayors last night, where he has made it very clear he's not going anywhere. Obviously, a message he delivered on this show earlier in the week as well. And I think there is a sense that's the strategy from the Biden inner circle, is to say, look, if you want him out, put up or shut up. If you really want him out, put your name to it and let's do this. And so far, very few Democrats have. And I think it's a sense of there is a reluctance to challenge someone who has been a good president in their eyes, who has been a faithful party member for so long. Also, real concerns about what the alternative would be if it's not President Biden, although we are seeing the vice president's poll numbers pick up of late. And there is a sense, and for my reporting, speaking to top Biden officials, that if they can get through this week, the odds of President Biden remaining the nominee go up dramatically. There are a few inflection points, though, that still could happen. One is, you mentioned, Senate Majority Leader Schumer. People believe if he were to change his mind, if a number of senators were to come to him and say, look, we're going to lose this House, this chamber, if Biden stays at the top of the ticket, and he makes that pitch to the president, maybe he'd listen. So far, though, Schumer shows no sign of doing that. Former Speaker Pelosi, who we'll have on the show later today, another voice that will carry a lot of weight. To this point, though, she hasn't called for President Biden to step aside, Mika. And there is this week here, we're going to talk more about NATO later, but a chance for President Biden to show, not just Democrats, but those eyes watching from around the world, that he's still up to this job. And that news conference tomorrow, which will be, since the debate, his first big moment, unscripted moment, where he has a chance to show Americans he can still do the job. If that goes well and lawmakers come and go from Washington this week without a rebellion, the Biden team thinks he'll get through it.
It's interesting. You talk about, what the alternative may or may not be. And that is an area where I think Democrats are self-destructing. I'll get to that in just a moment. But here's one Democrat who believes that Joe Biden should step aside. This is Congresswoman Mikey Sherrill of New Jersey.
I spent the week hearing from my constituents about their strong concerns about prosecuting the case against Donald Trump. I heard from people concerned about the Supreme Court decisions, concerned about abortion, women's reproductive health, and just advocating as strongly as possible that we have someone that can really take that case strongly and energetically to the voters.
Congresswoman Mikey Sherrill there, Allie. You were at that meeting yesterday, so I'll go to you with this notion. I think two things can be true at once. And I think a lot of Democrats are being very transparent about this notion that they're acting Trumpy and saying nothing to see here. I don't see that. I see a lot of Democrats saying he had a terrible debate. Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire, terrible night, but Donald Trump had a horrific presidency. And that's where I think Democrats should focus in on, because they're being self-destructive if they just tear President Biden down, but they don't offer an alternative. And right now, the alternative is Donald Trump. So if they have questions about Joe Biden's ability to run on this campaign, and a lot of them do, and the questions after the debate, are clear. They're very clear, and people have made them. What happened? Was it a one-off? Was it episodic? Everyone is asking that question. No one is hiding and pretending nothing happened. We all saw it. Kind of hard to avoid. So having said that, he also has a record that is historic. He also has a lot of things to say about why he should perhaps remain on this campaign. And he also is raising a lot of questions. But the opponent right now is Donald Trump. The opponent right now is arguably certifiable in terms of the things he says on stage. He may say them smoothly and get a laugh out of them, but they're crazy or cruel or anti-democratic or downright criminal, okay? The J6 hostages. And, he's a convicted felon. I think Democrats need to stay focused on who the opponent is, what the questions are about Biden, but don't forget his accomplishments. You know what? We can do several things at once, but I wouldn't crucify the one candidate you have right now unless somebody has an incredible alternative that is just a shoo-in, that would fit perfectly, that it works with the process and it represents what the American people wanted, then go for it. But I'm not seeing it, and I'm seeing a president who is extremely accomplished, who is running for re-election, who had a terrible night and is raising some questions against the opponent that I just described.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.